presenter. She is Holly Hunt. She is the president of International Animal Exchange, and today she'll be talking about conservative logistics, best practices in animal transportation, and what we have to learn in 60 plus years. Please welcome Holly.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Today's talk is about no surprises. Best practices in animal transport is really about no surprises. I'm going to start with a little background on myself and our company. International Animal Exchange was founded in 1960 by my dad and his brothers. They imported probably over 900 animals from Africa and around the world. They brought in most of their animals in the beginning by boat, and my uncle was living in Kenya and they were collecting giraffe, rhino, elephant, all kinds of things. You can see that picture on the top. I put that picture on here to sort of demonstrate things that we learned not to do. That happened, that was probably in 1961 or 62. And that was, I wouldn't say common practice, but the whole point of this is we learn every day, every year, every decade about how to do things better. The lower picture is my father at a pet store that they owned in Michigan before they got into the animal business, the exotic animal business. So when my father and my uncles were importing animals, they talked a lot with zoos about why they would need to import these number of animals in genetic diversity, and they might bring in maybe a boatload of 30 giraffe, which we'll see a picture of here. And then in those 30 giraffe, they would put them in quarantine and work with USDA and then distribute them around the country. In the original days, in the early days, we were doing it by boat, and I worked with USDA to establish the first protocols to bring these animals in by airplane. Now, this was very early on, where you can see it's not vector proof. Today, if we were able to import giraffe, which we're not at the moment, these crates would be completely vector proof, screen covered, and so they wouldn't have any vectors. The boat imports were 30 days or longer, so that was considered part of the quarantine. When we established these protocols for airline shipments, these animals would come in and we would have to go to a USDA quarantine station, either in Newburgh, New York, or in Miami. As I mentioned, in the early days, we imported probably 900 animals. We have evolved to becoming more of a service company than a product company. And I say that because the zoos have done such a great job with their planning and genetic diversity, and there was really no reason for us to import any additional animals. Now we are working with many zoos that we don't really talk about because we have NDAs on doing the logistics for them, from permits to coordination of the transportation to the documentation. I will accompany an animal shipment and be on the plane with going through the documents, testing, working with the veterinarians, working with the USDA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, CDC, traveling to Washington, DC to work with people on permits, those kinds of things. So we're going to talk today about why we move zoo animals. A lot of you in here are from zoos, but there's different reasons to move zoo animals than domestic animals. One of them would be breeding recommendations. If we want to take a giraffe from Fossil Rim and send it to somewhere else because Fossil Rim's been very successful in breeding giraffe, and we get a breeding recommendation. Habitat renovations. If the Cincinnati Zoo is renovating their exhibit and they need to move all their animals out, they would hire us to come pick up the animals and take them somewhere else while they're renovating their exhibit. Behavioral conflicts. We've all seen that in interspecies conflict. Animals just like people. Sometimes they just don't get along. The genetics match up perfectly, but they don't get along, so we have to move them out. Specialized veterinary care. would be like if a giraffe broke its leg and we need to take it to Auburn for a surgery. New facilities, like when Disney opened in 1990, whatever that was, Lynn can probably tell me. Or reintroduction, although that happens rarely. When we did the bongo reintroduction project in Kenya, we moved a bunch of bongo down to White Oak, and they were quarantined there and acclimated for their trip back to Kenya. So this is a little bit different on why zoo animals and domestic animals. Domestic animals, they're fairly limited numbers, where in zoos there's thousands of species. And domestic animals are moved routinely. Zoo animals are not really moved that routinely. Might have, in maybe Adam's career, he might have moved 20 giraffe, where in International Animal Exchange has, for example, moved probably 200 giraffe. Crates for domestic animals are usually commercially produced and easy to buy. Containers for exotic animals are usually custom built and built for a specific airplane, built for a specific animal. And so it's a lot more complicated. We may say, how big is a giraffe crate? We'll say, well, it depends. How big is the giraffe? And then you ask, how tall is the giraffe? Well, that's a funny question, because a giraffe, everybody in this room would answer that question just a little bit differently. Is a giraffe at this position, this tall, this position, when they're reaching to the top of the trees for some leaves? So really, those containers are custom. And then determining what kind of an airplane they're going to go in, if they're going to be on an air, how big is the door opening? And you saw on that other picture, that was a nose load. We don't use those anymore. We'll use 747 with side loads, and they contour the airplane. Sometimes we'll contour the crate to follow that. Requirements for domestic animals are spelled out. Requirements and protocols for zoo animals are not necessarily spelled out, and they change pretty regularly. The USDA has a great website called NCIE, National Center for Import Export, and it's very well designed, and it would show the species, the country from, and the country to, and then a drop-down menu on what the two governments have negotiated as a protocol. And then there's a little caveat on the end of it that says, check with your importing country to make sure this is, there wasn't a new disease that popped up 2 weeks ago and now we can't do this. The zoo animals, in terms of everybody in this room understands most of the complications with zoo animals, but the airlines may not they may not know what a kinkajou is, or a ferret, or something uncommon to them. And so they're sort of, what we found is communicating with them early and often, and going to the airport ahead of time, showing them a picture of the animal, a picture of the crate, talking it through, making them comfortable, bring the live animal regulation book, show them the book, show them where all of this is, communicating with them so there are no surprises when we're talking about air shipments. On the stakeholders, there are so many stakeholders when we're moving zoo animals, and very high emotions regarding moving animals, from the keepers, curators, zoos, consultants, airlines, government people. And as the people responsible for moving these animals, we have to deal with the emotions. There's facts about these kinds of things, and there's emotions about these kinds of things. And they need to be united to make the people who are working, shipping the animals, everybody along the way, from the truck drivers to the Fish and Wildlife inspectors to USDA, to the USDA veterinarians endorsing the health certificates, they all have an emotion, a feeling about this. So communicating with them, and no surprises, like Bonnie was saying, don't tell us 24, 48 hours, tell us 3 months before, invite us out, show us the crates, show us what you're going to do, explain the process. These kinds of communications and relationships are the key to successfully moving animals. There's just no other way to do it. They are not our enemies. We're all in here for the same reason. We want animals to be safely transported. Let me go backwards. So here are the questions that we asked that I'm going to run through this you know, who is the animal going from or to? I'm sorry, who are the people involved? Where is it going? How is it going? By truck, by air, by boat? What are the species? When and why? And those questions need to be answered to everybody along the way. You might have 30 people you're working with in this process, and we really need to think about those questions they're going to have to make them comfortable so everybody's shooting at the same goal. So ideal welfare outcomes. The ideal is that the animal arrives safe, uninjured, and reaches at the same or a better level of welfare in its new habitat. They are inherently stressful though, and we need to be honest with ourselves that an animal starting at the San Diego Zoo is going to have this level of welfare. During transport, there's going to be some additional stressors. And then the key is when it gets to its final destination, have the stressors been reduced to the point of the original. Unfortunately, now we have data on animal welfare assessments from prior to shipment, during shipment, and after shipment. Now, it's a little bit subjective, as everybody in this room can attest to, but that is why we would send people who are familiar with the animals, unlike the person with the dog. The people who would be zookeepers or caretakers, if we're bringing animals in from the wild, if they had worked with the animals in the wild, they would travel with them. They know their diet, they know their attitudes, they know their treats they like, any additional training they've done. Animals that are hand raised are generally a little bit easier to transport, except in special cases like a giraffe that won't get on a trailer because it doesn't operate in the same way. Kelsey just moved one a couple of weeks ago, and that was a very big challenge. When I was talking about measuring animal welfare during transport, it is, again, subjective, and that is why the person caring for the animal or the people caring for the animal at the origin facility should go, so they can be a true measure of how well the animal is doing during transport. So reducing stressors, these were all things that most people in here already heard a little bit about today. Light, temperature, humidity, smell, sound, motion. A stable environment is the least stressful. This thing, you guys are going to be a little bit surprised to hear this. When I do this class at Michigan State, I talk to the students about it. If we are able to choose an air shipment or a truck shipment, most people in that class, the zoology class at Michigan State, would say, well, why wouldn't you do it by air? They all raise your hand. Air is way better. Air is way better. Well, I'm going to tell you why it is better to move them by truck. This is a road transport. We're talking about changes in environment. Animal goes from enclosure into the container. The container is loaded into the trailer. The truck departs. Now that's 3 changes. Driving down the road, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Animal gets fed, checked every 2 hours, watered. We're monitoring it with cameras, temperature, carbon monoxide detectors, and smoke detectors. Animal then arrives at the destination. It's unloaded from the truck and then loaded into the enclosure or quarantine. So 6 changes of environment. In this, we have 20 changes of environment. The stressor, when you think about the animals loaded into the container loaded into the truck goes to the airport. It's unloaded at the airport. It's on the tarmac into the warehouse. Then it's palletized and weighed. It's very noisy and loud in there. That, as we know, some of those are not air conditioned. Some of them are cold in the winter, hot in the summer. It's taken out to the airplane. Now it's hot or it's cold. The airplane takes off. It's changing altitude. Then the airplane lands again, changing altitude. Open the door, additional noises, trucks and forklifts unloading. Container depalletized, loaded onto the truck. Well, it may have to sit in the warehouse for an hour or 2 to clear customs and have inspections, then loaded on the truck, then goes back to the receiving facility, it's unloaded from the truck and into the container. That is a lot of changes in environment. Changes in environment are more stressful than the length of the journey for the animals. So when you're thinking about that, common sense to all of us, I'm sure we all flew here because that was faster for us. And we like that because we can adapt to those changes in environment. These animals don't necessarily have that skill to adapt like that. So when I was talking about no surprises and communicating with everybody along the way, and I'm probably not overestimating, there's probably 30 people that we are in conversation with when we have an animal movie, even if it's a truck move from one zoo to another. But if it's an international one, it's certainly 30 people from Fish and Wildlife, USDA, maybe CDC, maybe state, as we're traveling through some states now, they require transit permits. So this is something that we learned a lot. And a very recent one we did, assuming that all emails or texts are read. They're not. We all know that, especially emails. And if you spend, someone spend an hour writing an email with a checklist of 20 things, and that is why it's sort of a belts and suspenders communication, where we would have weekly check-ins with a checklist and a program, and everybody involved is on it, and it's a Zoom call, and it's tedious, but it's required. So we follow up and follow up and follow up and follow up, and no surprises, no surprises. And using that term gotcha, it's a great term in text message because it's really important. If nobody responded gotcha, you can assume they didn't get it. So increasing the communication is critical, sometimes up to 2 weeks before we're having daily conversations. And when there's a time change or middle of the night, sometimes they're at night, early in the morning. This is another thing that my dad actually told me about 40 years ago, that animal moves are exciting for staff and families of staff, and even you call the airline and I want to book a capybara shipment. Well, that person's going home and telling their wife. So you really have to talk about these things and even ask for NDAs. I know NDAs sound like big bureaucratic things. They're fairly easy to find one online. And even though you can't, they're hard to enforce, but they understand that you really mean business. And if something happened and you went to ship some dolphins and there was a roadblock, we know we didn't tell anybody. Somebody told somebody. And that's why this communicating mindfully and making sure that everybody at the zoo along the way understands there are risks about talking about these things that are unintended. It's fun, it's sexy, but it's just no. The higher profile animals into large cities, which is sort of obvious, but it's a thing. I mean, we've seen it happen. We moved some elephants probably, 12 years ago from Botswana into South Africa because we couldn't get an airplane big enough coming out of Botswana. And we traveled through the middle of the night so that if those animals, because they originate in Botswana and were transiting South Africa, coming to the States, if they had gotten stranded in South Africa, they wouldn't have been able to go back to Botswana and they wouldn't have been able to go to the United States. And that is why we told the airlines they were rhinos up until about 5 minutes before, because elephants in South Africa are much more controversial. I mean, they're both controversial now, but then, and we will do that from time to time. Say it's, if I'm asking somebody to call an airline and ask, do you take dogs? And it's really a hyena. I really want to find out how big the door opening is, what kind of airplane, where it's going to stop, to make sure that if we're stopping in Europe on the way, that what are the dog requirements in Europe? Because if we're transiting a country going to another country, the animals on the airplane have to meet the requirements for that middle country, just in case something happens, the plane breaks down and we have to pull those animals off. If they don't meet that country's requirements, they'll put them down. I digress here, sorry. So communicating mindfully. activists. We all know that that's a challenge, and it's a, you know, we strive to be transparent, and that's important, but we can be transparent after the fact and spill it all out after, but we do not need to announce it. We don't do any press releases ahead of time. We actually tell all of our clients, no press releases, no, don't announce when anything's coming. Even staff limit it to a need to know program. So these are the details to keep guarded: sending and receiving facility date and time, vendors, using empathy with your staff. You know, we know that, you know, keepers get attached to animals and they really want to know where they're going, and they might have a friend at the Buffalo Zoo, they're going to call them, and we need to be empathetic with them and transparent and after the fact, but you just can't, for the sake of the animals, we just can't share it. The Hollywood effect. People act differently on camera. Even if your own team is filming it, don't. Unless there's an absolute good reason, there is no reason to film it. One, if something goes wrong, you definitely have but two, people really just act differently. I'm nervous standing up here in front of you. This is not the way I would have this conversation with you if I was in front of you. So emotions are part of this, and we really need to keep that in mind. Reputational considerations. An animal being moved might appear to have poor welfare. You see a rhino on a flatbed crate driving down the street, which we don't really see anymore because we don't move rhinos in flatbeds anymore. But you can imagine if somebody knew what was in there, or you pulled up to a truck stop, that could have some implications that the public doesn't understand, and we need to put ourselves in their shoes. All the photography and footage should be controlled and owned by the zoo. You know, we've had people offer, you know, we'll come and film it for free, and blah, but you can be, no, not interested, not interested. And that's it. Any questions?
Hello. Okay, there we go. All right, so if you have any questions in room, please raise your hand. If you are joining virtually and have a question, please put it in the Q&A and Karen will answer it. We'll start with the first question right here.
I think you made an excellent point about how people, even people that are trained and experienced, can act very differently if you put a camera in front of their face or they know they're being watched, right? So I'm trying to think of good, aside from the public relations part for the zoo, of good reasons for taking that footage. And one I can think of is, how do you get better for the next one? Since some of these moves are so individual, so unique. So kind of what's your process for debriefing after the move, and how do you notate or pay attention to things that could be better next time?
We have cameras in our trailers where we're watching animals, and we can use that in a training situation with our team. Typically, we did a giraffe tranquilization a couple months ago, and we have cameras all over our barns and film the whole thing and use that as a debrief. But we really discourage it in general. Usually you've got the top team of your group there, and we would get together and debrief and say, you know, that animal tripped coming out of the trailer. What could we have done differently to avoid that? But we all saw it with our eyes, so that kind of thing. But we really discourage it. I just, again, mostly for the reason that people act differently on camera.
Karen?
What is your best practice for the number of people and chase vehicles going with an overland shipment? What are the considerations for selecting those personnel?
We would typically like, as I mentioned, take the animal caretaker who has cared for that animal and who is familiar with that animal and maybe has done some training with that animal. We usually have 2 drivers and then a third person. The drivers switch out. We have DOT requirements that we have to comply with depending on the type of trailer, the distance. Veterinarians, Oftentimes when we move giraffe, we'll take a veterinarian in a chase vehicle. It really depends on the species, the length of the journey, the number of animals in the consignment, that kind of thing. So basically it just depends on the shipment. But having that contingency plan and having contacted everybody along the way, if we're going from Miami to Michigan, we would contact everybody along the way, our friends at ZAA zoos or AZA zoos, and talk about, we're coming through, we'll be through at between 2 and 4. If we have a situation, can we have a night number for you guys? And we'd, like to come over and that kind of thing. Fortunately, cell phones are really great, and these group text messages are very effective in communicating that. Something else we do, when I said don't take pictures, we do take pictures. Our own staff takes pictures of the animals during transit and sends them to our transit team. And in that picture, it happens every 2 hours. It's the time of where they offered water or food if the animal ate or drank, and the temperature inside the trailer and the temperature outside the trailer, and the weather. All of those things are important to know. I should have put this on here, but I don't. We have a pickup receipt and a delivery receipt, and we have that on there too. Time, temperature, indoor, in temperature inside the trailer, temperature outside the trailer, and weather, because the weather does matter. If it's rainy or humid, or it's smoky and you can't see with these fires. And there's a whole bunch of environmental concerns that we don't seem to, we are aware of because we're here doing it, but we don't necessarily document that. And that could be one little piece of information that could solve a question later on.
Okay, do we have any additional questions in here? Karen, any additional questions online?
Giraffes have poor outcomes directly related to transportation, such as dislocation of cervical vertebrae. What are your recommendations for shipping giraffes safely?
Use a tall trailer. The trailer that we use to transport giraffe in is 13.6 tall. And before we had this trailer, we had a trailer that we raised the roof on. It was a flat top, but we raised it so that when we're going down the road with giraffe in it, it was up. And then if it was empty and didn't have an animal in it, it was down. The trailer that we have now has a permanent angle to it. So it certainly accommodates the needs of the animals. They can turn around, and then we can split it into 2 or 3 stalls, and depending on the size of the animal. The key really, we think, in a giraffe move is the time of day you load, and that the load is low stress, that you've thought about it, put the trailer up there, let the animal go in and out of it. But if you get into a situation where you're taking 2 hours or 3 hours to load a giraffe into a trailer, call it, don't do it. Wait until it's calm. That the animal gets worked up, and then it's got that stress of being loaded into the trailer, and then the stress of the trip. I'm not sure if that answered the question. There is no way to guarantee that, because giraffe there's a very good question, because it's a challenge to move giraffe. But I think having the right equipment and the right people, the right understanding the timing and the stressors, and not be afraid to say, nope, calling it, we're not doing it today, we're going to do it tomorrow, we'll wait next week, leave the trailer there. So be flexible, and don't be locked into, we told them the exhibit's opening and the director wants the animal there by Tuesday because this exhibit's opening. Cannot be driven by that kind of a priority.
Okay, Karen, if you have any more, we probably have time for one more. Okay, we'll put your hands together for Holly Hunt.